Imagine creatures so old that they remember the first stones placed on the pyramids. Creatures so powerful that they can warp reality. Creatures so legendary that their descendants shape the world as we know it today. These are the Antediluvians. Welcome to Law of Darkness, a series where I take a deep dive into the rich and complex story of the World of Darkness tabletop RPG franchise and present it to you in an easy to understand and hopefully interesting way. If you haven't watched any of the previous videos in this series, I highly recommend you do so, as this story follows on from where those videos left off. Finally, if you enjoy these videos, please do consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel so that I know that you want to see more. With all that said, let's find out what happened to the second generation and finally talk about the infamous Antediluvians. When we last left off, the first vampire city of Enoch had been washed away by the great biblical flood known as the Deluge, killing all of the mortals within the city and decimating the vampire population that once ruled as gods. The ruler of the city, Caine, the legendary first vampire, had left his surviving children, believing that the flood was a punishment for the vampire's sins and fall into depravity. He would return one more time, but he would no longer be the ruler and tyrant of the vampire race. The second generation, Enoch the Wise, Irad the Strong, and Zillah the Beautiful survived the flood, and it was assumed that they would take the mantle as rulers. Out of the near 200 of the third generation who lived within Enoch, only 13 of them survived the flood. These 13 became known as the Antediluvians, which translates to before the flood. The Antediluvians would eventually go on to create the vampire clans that we know in the modern day game, and we'll be exploring each of them in their very own video, in which we'll talk in more detail about the part they play in vampire society and the actions they took in the upcoming nights. For now, we'll just go over each Antediluvian briefly, otherwise this would be a very, very long video. First off, there was Ventrue, who was the founder of the clan of Kings, also called the Ventrue. He was an advisor to Caine during the time of Enoch, which was a rare honour at the time for the third generation. Brujah was the founder of the clan of the same name, although his descendants are usually called the true Brujah. Unlike the hot-headed, rebellious clan as we know them today, Brujah and his kin were scholars, interested in learning and documenting knowledge of the young. Cappadocius was a vampire obsessed with the concept of death. He studied the concept of death and the afterlife and the soul, and his clan has a long, tragic history. They would eventually become Clan Giovanni, and finally, in modern nights, coalesce into what became Clan Hecata. Enoch was the founder of Clan Gangrel, and she was interested in the nature of the beast, the primal, almost sentient force within all vampires that rears its head during times of great fear, anger, or frenzy. There is a chance that it's through Enoch that the lupines, often just called werewolves, came to exist. Haqim was a warrior and a hunter. He was tasked with the defense of Enoch against the demonic Bali, which were both demons and demon worshippers at that time, and he created the clan Banu Haqim, or Assamites, as it used to be known, to do this. The Sombra was perhaps the most mysterious of the Antediluvians, by their very nature. Their true name is unknown, and unlike the other vampires, they found power when the Great Flood came. They learned to control the darkness it brought, and began to harness the powers of the realm known as the Abyss. Malkav was one of the oldest Antediluvians, and was capable of having powerful visions that could see through the fabric of reality itself. He went on to sire the Malkavian clan, who all share some of this insight. Absimilard was the founder of the clan Nosferatu, and he was a hunter that originally tried to kill Zillah when he was mortal. He failed, but Zillah was so impressed by his ability to hide from her that she embraced him rather than killing him, but not before leaving him with a permanent scar on his face to remember. Thracian was the founder of Clan Ravnos. He was turned by Irad in order to spy on the third generation, who Irad believed would eventually plot against him and his siblings. Saulot was an antediluvian that kind of stood apart from his kin in that he had a mostly peaceful temperament. He created the Salubri clan, who were healers and sages and prophets, and Saulot himself is said to have a physical third eye marking him with these prophetic abilities. And on top of this, he was thought to be one of the most loyal of the third generation. Arakel was thought to be the twin sister of Malkav and was the founder of Clan Toreador. She was an artist and a sculptor and made many of the beautiful artifacts within the first city before it fell, and her obsession with art made her one of those rare, empathetic antediluvians. Tzimisce was a flesh crafter. They were obsessed with the physical form, and they had the ability to change their own shape. One story says that they were actually created when Irad expelled the worst parts of himself, and then using his power of the discipline Protean, turned this into a physical mass or a physical being that a mortal consumed, and then became Tzimisce. Finally, we have Set, who was perhaps part of some sort of Egyptian royal family. His clan were originally known as the Followers of Set, and then later renamed to be called the Ministry. Set's followers differ in that they don't believe in Nodist law, which is the teachings of the Book of Nod and the more biblical myths that we've been covering in our previous episodes. But instead, they believe that Set is in fact an Egyptian god, and they have their own complex religion and origin stories regarding the kindred and where they came from and who the Antediluvians were. The Antediluvians all had complex relationships, histories, and goals, and as I said, we will be deep diving into them at another time, as well as having dedicated videos on each of their clans, and in this we'll learn why some of them you may not have heard of or I may not have covered in the previous 13. For now, what is important is that these 13 and the second generation were left to start again after Enoch. After some time, this fresh start became a vision of a second city, a better city, like Enoch, but more. It was built from the ground up to serve vampires. All but one of the Antediluvians stayed to help create this city. Tzimisce, who was always on a mission to understand the flesh, decided to leave before the city was established, travelling the world to learn more of their craft and eventually settling down in what is now Transylvania. For the remaining Antediluvians, there was one obstacle left before the new vampiric era could begin. And in their minds, this obstacle was the second generation. See, as I mentioned before, the second generation were naturally thought to inherit Caine's kingdom, and a lot of the Antediluvians decided that in this new age of vampires, they no longer wished to serve. Plans were made, lines were drawn, meetings in dark corners were had, and the Antediluvians rebelled. They struck out and attacked their sires with the intent to destroy them completely, granting them what is known as final death. There were many reasons the Antediluvians wanted to kill the second generation. Some, like Ventru, had always craved power. Again, they had sat at Caine's side and they believed that they deserved the rule. They wanted to kill their makers in order to sit upon the throne of the second city. Others, like Assimilard, wanted revenge. Assimilard never forgave Zillah for disfiguring and humiliating him, and he had vowed long ago to pay her back in kind. There are others still whose descendants swear to this day refused to take part in the rebellion, either out of loyalty or simple uninterest in the petty squabbles of their siblings. Regardless of motives, the Antediluvians were successful, and the second generation of vampires fell. It is assumed by most that they were given a final death, but as we know, in the world of darkness, the end is never the end. So what did happen, and could any of them still be out there? In the case of Irad, we're almost certain that he was given true death. There are stories that say that Irad betrayed Zillah and Enoch, his own brother and sister, because his need for bloodshed that had been growing and growing had become so strong at this point that he believed that only under the Antediluvians' rule could he fully indulge in this bloodlust like he never could under Caine's shackles. Whatever his motives, he was still ultimately betrayed, and once he'd helped destroy his siblings, the third generation turned on him and destroyed him. For Enoch, he was thought to be truly dead for centuries, possibly millennia. Still, there are stories of a sarcophagus, a kindred or vampire artifact that has never been opened, but is thought to contain something of immense power within. There are those that believe that this power is Enoch, who was laid in torpor, the long death-like sleep, for an age, but will eventually be awoken again. Finally, we have an end to the tragic tale of Zillah. When Zillah finally realized what her child meant to do, she knew she couldn't stop it. But in a last-ditch attempt at survival, she called out to her husband. She asked him to save her from the upcoming slaughter. And Caine, even in his self-imposed exile, heard the desperate cries of his wife. He used his power, and he turned her into stone. In doing so, ensuring that she couldn't be killed or devoured by the third generation. This stone became known as the Weeping Stone, a kindred artifact of great significance and pilgrimage. It lies in the mountains of what is now modern-day Iraq, and is said to constantly leak a blood-like liquid which, when drunk by vampires, gives them visions of ages past. Whatever was the fate of the second generation, it wasn't them that the Antediluvians now had to worry about. They had succeeded in their uprising, and the second city was theirs to rule. But such a betrayal never goes unpunished, and Caine saw what his grandchildren had done, and his anger was a force of nature. He gathered his power and his rage, and he cursed every single Antediluvian. These curses affected each of them differently and were designed as a specific punishment for their actions in the rebellion. For example, Similard was cursed with the hideous appearance that Nosferatu have today, that classic withered and hairless, sometimes even scaly visage that made the scar he received from Zillah look like a mere blemish. For the vast amounts of blood that Haqim had spilled in the rebellion, he was cursed with a constant need for it and a constant need to kill others of his kind. His gift in killing became his curse. Even Tzimisce, who had left before the rebellion, before the second city was even fully built, was cursed by Caine for his absence. He was cursed to only know true rest if he slept in the dirt of his homeland, so that he could never wander like that again. But Big Daddy Caine was not done there, and he did exactly what the archangels did to him those many years ago. And he made sure that these curses would not only affect the Antediluvians, but would be passed down to every single generation that they sired. Still, the Antediluvians had prevailed, the new city was built, and Ventrue and his children ruled as the clan of kings, just as planned. Most Antediluvians carved out a space within the city, even Saulot, who was thought to be loyal to Caine and to the second generation. He stayed to advise and guide his siblings. It was only Haqim that left at this point. It was said that he no longer wanted anything to do with his brothers and sisters, but there is a chance that this may have been because with the curse that Caine had put upon him staying amongst that city just increased the risk of him acting out and killing even more of them. Either way, he left the city with the few child that he had turned and eventually settled in the Middle East to create a wholly independent clan of warriors, scholars, and assassins that became known as the Banu Haqim or the Assamites. Now, despite being built on the foundations of parricide, the second city in some ways did do even better than the first, like the Antediluvians had planned. There is historical notes in the lore that it lasted longer and stood for longer than the first city did at the very least. The Antediluvians did what they did best. They pursued their own interests, their own motives. They had as many mortal followers as they could ever need, and they created their own children, who in turn did the same to help them achieve their goals. And this fourth and fifth generation of vampires became known as the Methuselah. Inevitably, a city built on betrayal will eventually fall to it, and the fear of it began to spread across the second city like a festering rot. It wasn't just fighting between siblings that caused this paranoia. The third generation had killed the second, and the Antediluvians lived in fear that the Methuselah would eventually rise up against them and do the same. This fear finally blossomed when Bruja decided to leave the second city, only to be murdered outside of its gates by Troil, his own child. This action was the beginning of the end for the second city. Eventually, the Antediluvians themselves disappeared into the pages of history. They either went into hiding, entered the death-like sleep we call torpor to wait away the centuries, or they did inevitably meet final death. The Methuselah and their kin continued to spread across the globe, but still, they all lived in fear of being usurped by their children. It was a double-edged sword. Each generation needed to create more kindred to fight their various battles, to be spies, to be generals, to be troops. But in doing so, they created more possible weapons that would eventually be used against them. This constant fear and battle between parent and child became known as the Jihad. It was a secret war that all vampires within society are part of, whether knowingly, willingly, or not. I could do a whole video on the Jihad, although with the unfortunate name for it, I doubt the video would be monetized, and we'll see if even this one does, so we might get to it, or we might just incorporate it into other videos. Anyway, it is thought by some that the Jihad will all eventually culminate into something called Gehenna, which is the end times for vampires. It is thought that when the remaining Antediluvians eventually rise again, they will kill or consume all of their children, essentially wiping out the vampire race, before finally facing Caine in vengeance for the curses he placed upon them. Over time, the Jihad would evolve and grow, and ideas of Gehenna would be split between those that wanted to stop it from happening, those that wanted to cause it, and even those that denied it and the existence of Antediluvians altogether. It would split vampire society into three distinct sects: the Camarilla, the Sabbat, and the Anarchs. But that is a story for another time. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it easy enough to follow and enjoyed learning about the lore of the World of Darkness. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you think there's something I've missed. There is a lot of material, a lot of conflicting stories, and I'm not an expert, so there will likely be things that didn't make the video, either intentionally or unintentionally, and I'm always open to helpful feedback. Please join us next time, when we'll be diving into the most famous of these vampire sects, and the creator of the Masquerade, from where we get the game's name, the Camarilla. Until then, stay safe, keep an eye on the shadows, and remember, in a world of darkness, the end is never truly the end.